Hello, we continue with Unit 2. Now we are in Session 2 of International Trade. I am your host, Elias. Now here we are going to look at technical progress and then define the nature of trade as well as what happens to the volumes of trade. Okay, so let's begin with technical progress. So technical progress increases the productivity of a nation's factors of production and has the same general effect on the nation's production possibility frontier as an increase in the supply of the factor inputs. Now, remember that when we looked at the production possibility frontier, we assumed that technology was fixed. Now, if we improve technology, it means that the amount of labor or the capital that we will need in the production process will be reducing because we will rely on the new technology. And therefore, less factor inputs will be needed to produce the same levels of output. As such, we call the technical progress, we also call them as the Hickesian technical progress. And this comes about because of the person who brought them into this theory, John Hicks. So they are named after John Hicks and they are termed Hickesian technical progress. So with Hickesian technical progress, we define three types of technical progress. The first one being the capital saving technical progress, or the K saving technical progress. Then we also have the labor saving technical progress, or termed the L savings technical progress. And lastly, we will look at the neutral technical progress. Now we will be describing each of these in more details, where we would have to look at the effect on the factor productivity, and therefore later on we will look at the effect on the volumes of trade. Okay, then we also note that regardless of the type of the technical progress, all technical progress reduce the amount of both labor and capital required to produce any given level of output. This means that we will not focus on the factor intensity, because technology will have changed. It means that the intensity of the factors will be reduced, but the productivity, however, will be changing, will be improving. So as the productivity is improving, because remember, the fewer units you have, the more productive they become, because you will be using fewer, say, labor with more capital, and therefore you will need more labor, which means labor becomes productive. So here, regardless of the intensity of a factor, when we have technical progress, we will use fewer units of labor and fewer units of capital to produce the same level of output that we would have produced in the absence of technical progress, but increasing the factor inputs. Okay, so let's start by looking at the capital saving technical progress. So this increases the productivity of labor proportionately more than the productivity of capital. Now let me bring this equation, this ratio to you. So if we have capital saving technical progress, it means that then the productivity of labor is growing. So it has made the productivity of labor to grow than the productivity of capital, which means then that for you to produce more, you will need more labor to be substituted for capital in the production process. So because this time around it means there is less labor, and therefore labor has become more productive, calling for the increase in the labor units to increase the production of the commodity. And as such, as a result, we see that labor will be substituted for capital in production. And therefore, if labor is substituted, considering L over K, if labor has increased, so you're bringing in labor and you are removing capital channeled to labor, then the numerator here will grow while the denominator will be declining. As such, the whole of this ratio will rise. Or looked the other way, if we are increasing labor because you are substituting labor for capital, the denominator here will grow while the numerator will be declining, and therefore the whole of this ratio will fall at unchanged relative factor prices. So where wage over rental price of capital remain unchanged. And what we will note then is that a given output can now be produced with fewer units of labor and capital, but with a higher labor capital or a lower capital labor ratio, where we are seeing now that we are increasing the amounts of labor in the production process, but still we are keeping the capital labor ratio very low. Okay. Let's now look at the labor savings technical progress, where we see the kind of technical progress that increases the productivity of capital proportionately more than the productivity of labor. Now, this means that if the productivity of capital is made to be more than the productivity of labor, the firm will produce more units by substituting capital for labor, meaning that more capital will be used in place of labor, and therefore will be keeping the capital labor ratio high or the labor capital ratio low. So as K is substituted for labor in production, the capital labor ratio will rise because you are increasing your capital units and reducing your labor units. Therefore, if the numerator grows compared to the denominator, it means that the whole of this ratio will rise, given that the factor prices are constant. The relative factor prices are constant. And with that, we note that a given output can now be produced with fewer units of labor and capital, but with a higher capital labor ratio. So as such, we will notice that in as much as we are increasing the amount of capital and reducing the amount of labor, the actual amounts that will be used, the productivity specifically, will be different. So remember, we will use fewer units, but we will notice that we will have a higher capital labor ratio because we are saving the labor in our technical progress. So more capital will be coming into the production process in place of the labor, and therefore keep the capital labor ratio high. We also have the neutral saving technical progress, or simply termed neutral technical progress, where the increase in the productivity of labor and capital is in the same proportion, and as such the capital labor ratio or the labor capital ratio remains unchanged after the technical progress has taken place as it was before this change, keeping the relative factor prices constant. Now, when the technical progress is neutral, it means that neither capital nor labor is substituted in the production process. So you will have your capital, you will have your labor, but none of the two will be substituted. So if you are removing capital, you will have to remove the labor from the production process, but not substitute one for the other. So what we will note then is that the given level of output will now be produced with fewer units of labor and fewer units of capital. So take note, with neutral technical progress, no substitution of labor for capital or capital for labor will take place, but we will have fewer units used in the production of a given output. Okay, so let's look at the graphical illustration. So now consider where we want to show the neutral technical progress. Consider the solid blue line and then the solid black line. If we begin with the solid black line, a nation is in autarky at point A, where it's producing and consuming 50 units of X and 60 units of Y. And if the nation specializes in producing commodity X, it will move along the black frontier all the way to point B, and at point B, remember, this is 130 units of X which will be produced. So 130 units of X will be produced, and if labor grows or labor doubles, and then the capital also doubles in the production of commodity X, meaning we have we have technical progress for all. So if you improve the inputs in both inputs in the production of X, then the production of commodity X will also double from 130 to 260. And the same analysis will be observed if you look at commodity Y. Okay, so let's now take the growth and trade for a small country, and specifically we look at the effect of growth on trade. Now, factor growth and technical progress, remember that they all shift the nation's production frontier outward. If you have technical progress, or if technology improves, it means that the nation will be able to produce more units with fewer inputs or fewer resources. And if resources improve given the technology, then the nation will again be able to produce more. Therefore, factor growth and technical progress will tend to shift the nation's production frontier outward. But what we see is that the volumes of trade the changes in the volumes of trade will depend on the rate at which the output of the nation's exportable and importable commodities grow. And also, it will depend on the consumption pattern of the nation as its national income expands through growth and trade. Now, this is where we tend to describe trade as either growth as either pro-trade, anti-trade, or neutral, depending on what happens to the volumes of the production for the exportable and importable commodity, or to the consumption of the exportable and importable commodity. So let's take a deep dive on this. So if the output of the nation's exportable commodity grows proportionately more than the output of its importable commodity at constant relative commodity prices, then growth tends to lead to greater than proportionate expansion of trade, and it is said to be pro-trade. Now, what we see here is that if the output of a nation's exportable commodity grows proportionately more than the output of the importable commodity, it means that the nation will now be able to export more units because it has produced more of the exportable commodity. That is the commodity of its comparative advantage. And as such, it will be able to export more units to the other country. And if the nation, the same nation, has produced less of its importable commodity, it means that the nation will have to import more because locally the amount of the import substitute are low. And therefore, to meet up with consumption, the nation will have to import. So given that the nation has produced more for export, and therefore it will export more, and it has produced less of the importable commodity, and therefore it will have to import more, then the volumes of trade will grow by more than proportionate. And therefore, the growth in such growth in the factors is said to be pro-trade, or such growth is said to be pro-trade. We can look at this also in terms of consumption. So if the nation's consumption of its importable commodity increases proportionately more than the nation's consumption of its exportable commodity at constant prices, then the consumption effect tends to lead to a greater than proportionate expansion of trade, and such growth is said to be pro-trade. Now, what we notice here is that if the consumption of the nation's importable commodity has increased, it means that the nation will be importing more. And if the consumption of the exportable commodity has reduced or has grown, but by less than proportionate compared to that of the importable commodity, it means that the nation then will be exporting more because less of it is consumed. So therefore, the rest has to be exported. Now, given that the consumption of the exportable commodity is low and therefore many units are exported, and given that the consumption of the importable commodity is high and therefore more units are imported, then the volumes of trade tend to improve. And therefore, such growth is said to be pro-trade. If the output of the nation's exportable commodity grows proportionately less than the output of its importable commodity, which here now we are seeing that the output of the exportable commodity is less compared to the output of the importable commodity. In other words, the country or a nation has produced fewer units of a commodity of its comparative advantage, and then has produced more of the commodity of its comparative disadvantage. It means that this nation will export less, or if possible, there will be no trade because the units of what it can export are few. And if it has produced more of of a commodity of its comparative disadvantage, or what it could have imported, it means the nation will not be able to import at all because it has more that it has produced which it should have imported. Given that the volumes, the amount of commodities which could be exported are few and the import is also less, it means that the volumes of trade will reduce. And as such, we see that the growth tend to lead to less than proportionate expansion of trade, and such growth is said to be anti-trade. Now, you can look at this in terms of the consumption. I'll leave it out for you to define anti-trade in terms of consumption. Let's look at the neutral growth. So if the output of the nation's exportable commodity grows at the same rate as the output of its importable commodity at constant relative commodity prices, then growth tends to lead to a proportionate expansion of trade and is said to be neutral. So since what could be exported has grown proportionately, grown at the same rate as what could be imported, then growth is neutral. And as such, you will notice that the nation will have a certain amount exported and a given amount imported, and there will be no change in the volumes of trade. And such growth is said to be neutral. So we should note that both production and consumption can be pro-trade, anti-trade, or neutral. And with that, then we see that the effect on the volumes of trade will depend on the net effect of the production and consumption effect. Then if both production and consumption are pro-trade, the volume of trade expands proportionately faster than the output. So remember, by output, we are looking at what is produced as a nation, and therefore when we are looking at the volumes of trade, we are looking at what is exported from what it has produced and what is imported. So if both production and consumption are pro-trade, then it means that the volumes of trade will expand proportionately more than the output. And then we see that if production and consumption are both anti-trade, the volumes of trade will expand proportionately less than output and may even decline absolutely. So because what is happening is that production is anti-trade and consumption is anti-trade, that means that the volumes of trade will be low compared to what is produced. This is because the nation has produced more of what it could have imported as opposed to what it should have exported, and therefore it will export less and import more, and therefore consumption will follow suit, and such trade will be anti-trade. And if production is pro-trade and consumption is anti-trade or vice versa, then what will happen to the volumes of trade would depend on the net effect of the two opposing forces, that is the production side and the consumption side. And finally, in the unlikely event that both production and consumption are neutral, trade expands at the same rate as output. and therefore we will not have any of the two pushing the other, so there will be some neutral stance. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, remember to send an email to moauelias@gmail.com. I will see you in session 3, where we will conclude growth and trade.